to this morning's meeting.
There we go.
Right, sorry. I think Shazia, who is standing in for our clerk who is unwell, which is why she's on the screen up there, not in the room with us, we're practicing social distancing just to be on the safe side. So for the benefit of new members, this is not quite as we normally do things. Things might be slightly out of order. We will get there, okay? So please bear with us and be patient. And I'm now going to hand over to Shazia.
Thank you, Councillor Massey. So I'm acting as the clerk for this meeting today. As we've said, Amanda's not available, but she will be presenting 2 reports from another room. So Chair of Policy and Resources Committee is Councillor Brenda Massey, in accordance with terms of reference for the Policy and Resources Committee, whereby at the Fire Authority meeting on the 21st of June, Councillor Massey was voted the Chair of the Fire Authority itself and therefore automatically becomes Chair of this committee also. Item 1, election of the Vice Chair for Policy and Resources Committee. Can I have a proposer, please?
I'd like to propose Councillor Smith.
Can I second Councillor Smith?
In which case Councillor Smith is duly elected as Vice Chair. For information, Angie Feeney is your lead director for this committee, so any queries, any questions, please speak to Angie in future or the clerk. I'll pass over to you now, Councillor Massey.
Thank you. Do we have any apologies for absence? Because I've got Councillors May, Payne and Brennan down here, but I don't know if there's any others to add to that. Right, so we're just waiting for... Okay, that's fine, thank you. Good. So the emergency evacuation measures?
Thank you, Chair. There is not a planned fire alarm test today, so if the fire alarm does come and we need to evacuate the building, we will support you to do so through the nearest exit.
Thank you. And I know Emma's probably gone to rescue somebody who can't get in, but please can I ask, if you have a mobile phone with you, you turn it on to silent? Thank you. Okay, can I have declarations of interest then? I believe all the members of the Service Leadership Board, including the Chief Fire Officer, Assistant Chief Fire Officers, Director of Corporate Services, Clerk and the Statutory Finance Officer have an interest in paper 15, which is the commissioning of the independent review of senior officer salaries. Are there any other declarations of interest not covered by that? No? Okay, lovely. Public access, I believe we've not received any public access inquiries. Right. So, Chair's business. I'm going to hand over to you, Simon, for this one.
Yes, members, since we last met... Sorry, thank you, Angie. Members, since we last met, very sadly, one of our firefighters, firefighter Ollie Hatfield, passed away recently as a result of a battle against long illness, cancer. We're very saddened to hear, obviously, after a valiant battle against the disease, that Ollie had passed away. Ollie embodied everything in terms of values that our service could ask for in one of its employees. Whilst he was so proud and happy to be a firefighter in our service and in Avon Fire and Rescue Service, the real beneficiary was having such an employee as Ollie serving our communities. So as a mark of respect and in remembrance, members, can I ask you to take to your feet, please, and have for a minute's silence. Thank you, members.
Thank you. And I'd like to welcome you all to the first meeting of the Policy and Resources Committee. And for the benefit of the recording, I confirm that this committee meeting is taking place at headquarters in Portishead. We're also recording the meeting for the public to view on the Fire Authority YouTube channel. And I'd like to go around the room and ask, first of all, members to introduce themselves, and then we'll move on to officers introducing themselves. So, just working out which direction to go. Let's go that way round. So, can we have members from, I think, Richard, you're probably the first member.
Councillor Eddie Bristol.
Councillor Steve Smith, Bristol City Council.
Councillor Dan Thomas, North Somerset.
Councillor Karen Walker, Bath and North East Somerset Council.
Councillor Rongartheni Baines.
Councillor Philippa Hume, Bristol City Council.
Councillor Ron Hardy from South Gloucester.
I think that's all the members. So can I now ask officers to introduce themselves? I'll start with you, Sam.
Thank you, Chair. Good morning, members, colleagues. Simon Shilton, your Chief Officer and Chief Executive.
Good morning, I'm Angie Feeney. I'm a Director of Corporate Services here at Avon Fire and Rescue Service.
Good morning, members and colleagues. Richard Welch, Assistant Chief Fire Officer.
Good morning, I'm Verity Lee, Statutory Finance Officer.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Karen Shield. My substantive role in the fire service is the Head of Human Resources. My role here today is the Her Majesty's Inspectorate Spotlight Report Lead for the service.
Good morning, members. My name is Richard Stokes and I'm Diversity Inclusion Manager.
Morning, my name is Tanya Nathan and I'm the Procurement and Supplies Manager.
Good morning, Pete Davis. I'm the Service Liaison Officer for His Majesty's Inspectorate of Constabulary and Fire and Rescue Services.
Good morning, I'm Ian Potter and I'm Head of Transformation at Avon Fire and Rescue.
Good morning, I'm Sarah Fariki. I'm from One Legal and I'm here to present the desktop review that we've undertaken on behalf of the fire service.
And I'm Shazia Dyer, Director of One Legal, and I'm here for that report, but also to assist with clerking the meeting in the absence of your clerk.
Can you introduce yourself, please, Amanda?
Good morning, members. Apologies I can't be in the room. I'm Amanda Brown, the Avon Fire Authority Clerk.
Thank you. And can I remind all members to please remember to use the microphones when you're speaking and turn them off when you've finished, because it's quite a large room and the acoustics aren't brilliant for some of us, so thank you. Right, we're moving the agenda around slightly at the moment, so I think, well, sorry, you have to bear with us, we're doing this a bit ad hoc this morning, so, sorry? 7, yeah, that's right. So we'll move on to the, I should have said actually about voting. Any voting required will take place by asking members for a show of hands in the order of votes against, any abstentions and any votes for. So if we do need to vote, that's the way we will be doing it. Item 7 on the agenda are the minutes of the ordinary meeting of the People and Culture meeting held on the 3rd of March this year. And can I ask members to approve the minutes for People and Culture meeting on the 3rd of March, to include the confidential committee minutes and the performance review and scrutiny meeting on the 20th of April? I'm proposing them. And
seconded, Chair.
Thank you, Richard. Great. Everybody accept that?
Aye.
Right. I know there was a number of you who weren't actually members at the time, so difficult for that one. Right, the next one are the minutes of the ordinary meeting of the performance review and scrutiny meeting held on the 20th of April this year.
Seconded.
Right, thank you. That's what I like. I don't even get a chance to speak. Great. Everybody in favour of those? If you were here, you probably weren't. Right. Thank you. Next one's the confidential minutes of the ordinary meeting of the People and Culture Committee held on the 3rd of March.
Second.
Again. Right. Everyone okay with those? Yep. Great. Okay. And just to explain that I attended the People and Culture meeting, and together with Councillors Tucker and Wilcox, we've confirmed the accuracy of the minutes. Councillor Payne has confirmed the accuracy of the PRSC minutes. And I think that's all of them. So, because they've already been agreed. Right, and I think we're moving on to item 15. Yeah, we're jiggling the agenda around a bit to allow our clerk to do her couple of reports first, and then, as she's unwell, she can go home. So, over to you, Amanda, please.
Thank you, Brenda. Good morning, members. I hope you can hear me, and I apologise for not being in the room. So my paper 15 is at page 147 of your bundle, and it's the paper entitled Independent Review of Senior Officer Salaries. So this paper is being brought to you following the annual general meeting on the 21st of June, when you considered a report on the annual review of remuneration for Chief Fire Officer, Chief Executive, and the Fire Authority decided at their AGM to ask you, as the Policy and Resources Committee, to commission an independent review of senior officer salaries. So that's the recommendation of the paper at paragraph 2.1. I won't cover everything in my paper, but if I briefly explain the background, again on page 147, in 2017, Avon Fire and Rescue Service restructured its senior management team. So the role of Deputy Chief Fire Officer was removed, which was a saving to the service, and that left 2 Assistant Chief Fire Officers, 1 Director of Corporate Services, and then you also had 2 Statutory Officers, which is myself and the Statutory Finance Officer. You will recall from the paper you considered at the AGM that all the senior officers' team salaries are calculated by reference to the Chief Fire Officer's salary, so they're a percentage. And that percentage and the salaries themselves have not been reviewed since those changes in 2017. So the Chief Fire Officer recommended at the AGM that we consider at this time having an external independent review, just to ensure that those salaries reflect the changes in director and officer responsibilities, so the percentages are right, and also undertake some benchmarking against the fire sector, but also the local authority sector. So if I turn over the page to page 148 of the bundle, you will see that there are financial implications in this report, because if we do commission this independent review, the costs are roughly £3,500 plus VAT. I then explained to you the terms and conditions which apply to the Chief Fire Officer, which is paragraph 5.1, which is known as the Gold Book. And there is within the Gold Book a list of considerations which should be taken when looking at the Chief Fire Officer's pay, and that is provided for you at Appendix 1. And I've summarised some lists from that at paragraph 5.3 of the paper. If you then move over to page 149 of the bundle, I have also provided for you in Appendix 2 the recent document published by the National Joint Council called the Brigade Managers Pay Survey Report for 2021 and 2022, which was not available at the AGM. The data within that report is not totally up to date because it doesn't include the recent pay awards, which were made for January 22 and January 23. However, it is a document that the independent experts will need to consider as part of their review. Finally, at paragraph 5.7, I confirm that Appendix 3, there is a proposal. I contacted 3 organisations to see if they could help us with this review, and the only organisation which replied substantively was South West Councils, and their proposal is at Appendix 3. So my recommendation is to you that we commission an independent review by South West Councils. They have kindly indicated that if they complete their interviews with senior officers by the 1st of September, they are confident that their report should be available for your next meeting, so that would save any further delay. So happy to take any questions from members, please.
Richard, Steve?
It's not actually a question or a statement, really. Obviously, this report follows on from the agreement we made through a board debate at the AGM. Obviously, this is important we do this. The next stage is commissioning the independent review. South West Councils, on the information provided and my knowledge of them, seems a very good partner agency, so I recommend we go ahead.
Yeah, thanks, Amanda. Totally agree with that. And apologies, Amanda, I haven't raised this with you in advance because I've literally just thought of it this morning, but we did consider, as part of the governance review, commissioning a review of members' allowances, particularly with regard to the new roles that have been created in the new structure. I just wonder, is there any value in commissioning those two pieces of work jointly, or are they so entirely separate from one another that it doesn't add anything?
Councillor, thank you for that question. A very sensible question. I don't think there is any benefit in doing them both at the same time because they are completely different beasts. However, what I agreed, I think at the AGM, was that I would seek to see how the new committee structure worked and what responsibilities the new members had in their new roles, for example, as vice chairs. And then we would commission a further update to the independent review by a different member of staff at South West Council. That's Bryony Holden, that's her area of expertise, whereas this would be undertaken by a different person at South West Council. So I think keep the two separate, but the other one's very much still on my radar and will be done later in this municipal year.
That makes sense, thank you.
Any other comments? Simon, do you want to say?
No, it's all
okay. Right, so that's the end of that item. Okay. Shall we go to a vote on accepting the proposal?
In that case, can I propose a recommendation?
I'll second it. And can I see everybody in favour, please? I think that's unanimous. Right, thank you. Okay, thank you, Amanda, for that. And we'll take item 17 next, because that's your second one, isn't it? The proposed new local pension board terms of reference.
Thank you, Brenda. So, members, I hope you can still hear me. So, my second paper is at page 183 of your bundle. So this paper is necessary following the recent independent governance review, which made several recommendations. The local pension board met on the 10th of July and they considered a report from myself on the implications of those changes and how their terms of reference would need to change so that they align with the new governance arrangements, which basically ensures that your committee, Policy and Resources Committee, now acts as scheme manager for the pension schemes, and also to add clarity to those terms of reference. So whilst we were amending them, we decided to tidy up some of the bits of those terms of reference which were not worded very well. So the local pension board did consider these new terms of reference on the 10th of July. They have recommended that you adopt them. So that's what the recommendation is, to ask you to approve those new terms of reference in Appendix 1. I can go through the detail, but I think they're pretty much self-explanatory. The only bit which is entirely new is the bit at the end. So you've got some Annex A and Annex B, which really clarify how we appoint both member representatives and also the independent chair for the local pension board, and I think that clarity was needed. You also have Councillor Smith here, who is a member of local pension board, so hopefully he can help me answer any questions. So I'm happy to take any questions you might have.
Thank you, Councillor Smith.
Yeah, I just wanted to confirm what Amanda said. We considered this at the local pension board a few weeks ago. We went through a track changes version of it in detail, and it really is tidying up, aligning to the new committee structure. It doesn't change anything significant about what the board does. It's adding clarity, and we totally supported it.
Questions from anybody? No? In that case, can I see those in favour of accepting the report? Please raise your hands. Yeah, that's unanimous. Thank you. Thank you, Amanda. I think that concludes your papers today. So thank you for being here, and I hope you feel better soon.
Thank you. Sorry I wasn't in the room, members, but thank you very much. See you soon.
Thank you. Right. This is a somewhat unusual meeting because we're flipping around to fit people in, so please bear with me if we get a bit out of order. I think we've got as far as taking that and that. Public act. Right, okay. That's this. Good. Right. Item 9. That's Pete Davis. Are you going to present? Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. Good morning, members. As I introduce myself, Pete Davis, I'm the Service Liaison Officer for His Majesty's Inspectorate of Constabulary and Fire and Rescue Services. We love an acronym in the fire service. Not all of them are that long, but for ease of reference and for the purposes of the recording, I shall refer to that as HMI CFRS, or probably more likely just as HMI, so at least you know what I'm talking about. Members, my report is for information and is presented at page 25 of your bundle and is accompanied by one appendix, which I'll come on to shortly. Just for the benefit of new members, the presentation of this regular report to the committee is part of the governance arrangements which we wrap around our HMI inspection activity. HMI activity was reintroduced to the Fire and Rescue Service sector back in 2017, and our first inspection was in 2018, with the report being published in December 2018. As a result of each inspection report, of which we've now had 2 full rounds of inspection, we produce an action plan to address the areas for improvement identified within those reports by the independent inspectorate. And under the previous structure of the Fire Authority, those reports, as agreed by the full authority, are tabled to each meeting of what was the Performance Review and Scrutiny Committee, and now has come under the auspices of the new Policy and Resources Committee under the authority's new structure. Whilst HMI does not formally endorse those arrangements which we've wrapped around the governance of our action plan, it has found favourable comment from HMI in the way that we do this, and it certainly has stood us in good stead since inspection activity was reintroduced in 2017. So we propose to continue with that as we have done previously. With that background, the report is basically split into 2 parts. One is an update on the areas for improvement which emanated from our Round 2 report, which was published by HMI in December 2021. And the second part is just to update members on current HMI-related inspection activity. So turning to that first part to begin with, the Round 2 Inspection Action Plan and version 2.10 of our current Inspection Action Plan is appended at Appendix 1 to my report and provides an update on the current progress with the action plan which we developed and was approved by the previous incarnation of this committee, the PRSC, to meet the 22 areas for improvement identified in our Round 2 inspection report. The table on page 27 of your bundle, which is page 3 of my report, provides the current status of where we are with the total of 64 individual actions which we developed to address those 22 areas for improvement. Those figures there are provided in the table against the 3 pillars of effectiveness, efficiency and people. And the important figures there are the ones in bold in each cell. Just for a point of administration really for members, the trend analysis which is provided in the brackets after each of those bold figures, for the purposes of the report, provides a direction of travel since you received, or your previous incarnation of the committee received this report in January 2023. So whilst the figures in bold are the same, the trend analysis compared to the table on page 34 of your bundle, those trend analysis figures are slightly different because that's comparing it to the last version of the HMI action plan, which goes to each meeting of the service leadership team. So just to explain why those trend analysis figures are slightly different between the table on page 27 and that on page 34. Overall, the action plan as last approved by the service leadership team was 37% complete. That's 24 out of the 64 actions. 55% in progress. That's 35 out of the 64 actions. And 8%, that's 5 out of the 64 not yet started. And the latest updates are provided in red text within the body of the appendix. One of the administrative issues that we kind of battle with is each time this is presented to the committee, we present the last SLT approved version, and because of the lead time in preparation of papers for this committee and the schedule of meetings of the SLT, it means that the one that was presented to you today is dated the 22nd of May, but since the deadline for submission of the papers, there has been a further version considered by the SLT at its meeting yesterday. So we're just finalising that for publication, but two important updates in the very latest version of the plan is the completion of two values-related actions, the promotion of the core code of ethics and our revised leadership charter, which I've got a copy of here. That's on page 84 of your bundle, which has now moved from in progress to complete, and the refresh of our values, ethics and behaviour framework, which is on page 86 of your bundle, an action there, and again that's been completed. So that's two important actions which have moved from in progress to complete in the very latest version, which will be published shortly. Just moving on from the appendix, which is the action plan, to current HMIC related inspection activity. The service has been very busy over the last 9 weeks since the start of our round 3 inspection. So we started that back in May, and we are just now coming to the tail end of that 10-week inspection programme. So as you can see at paragraph 4.5 of my report on page 28, that's included a whole range of activity with external HMI inspectors being in service and interviewing heads of departments via virtual means, staff survey, interviews with representative bodies, desktop reviews, focus groups and the like. Overall collated about 1,500 pieces of evidence, which they'll now start to analyse. In terms of the outcomes of that round 3 inspection, we don't have a definitive timeline from that. It'll depend on how long HMI take to analyse and start to draft their report. But I imagine that we will probably get a draft report for factual accuracy checking somewhere around the autumn period, and a publication of our final round 3 report into the public domain, I would estimate, as being before the end of the calendar year. They did make some changes in round 3 inspection, such that the aim is to reduce the amount of time between the on-site inspection activity and the publication of the final report into the public domain. As is the case for all inspection activity, the ultimate aim is improvement. So whatever comes out of that report, we will then develop an action plan against those areas for improvement and proceed in a similar fashion to how we've done through rounds 1 and 2. Paragraph 4.7 on page 29 just highlights the fact that we've also got a concurrent action plan against the Spotlight report on values and culture, which is the subject of a separate paper to this committee today, so I won't say any more about that. But since the submission of this report for inclusion in the committee's papers, we've also had notification that the Home Secretary has commissioned an additional thematic inspection on the handling of misconduct cases in fire and rescue services. So that will be slightly different to the form of our round 3 inspection. That's a thematic inspection, so we'll be looking at across all 44 English fire and rescue services. Each one of those 44 services will receive a staff survey as part of their evidence gathering for that thematic inspection. There will be some additional questions added to our routine data request in the autumn in order to provide some extra evidence for the purposes of that thematic inspection. And 10 fire and rescue services will be selected for on-site review and inspection work, again to inform that thematic inspection, which is due to be published by June 2024. So I think, Chair, that covers my report, and I'll pause for any questions.
That's really helpful. Any questions from anybody? Richard, and then Steve.
Not really a question, Chairman, more a comment. As Peter said, he's diligently brought previous updates to the former committee, and I believe to the full authority, and they have been very reassuring. As he made allusion to, I think the key table for that, or piece of information for members, is the table found on page 27, which Duke does confirm consistent progress being made. I'm particularly pleased with the zeros in column 3, indicating there are no unresolved issues in progress, so that's good. So again, just congratulations. Thank you for you and your team's work.
Yeah, thank you. Just a couple of questions, and apologies for being new to this. These may be things that have been covered before in other meetings, but first, a general point. Once we've got the round 3 inspection report later this year, can we assume that anything in this report that's not been completed will just carry on, or will be merged into the new action plan for round 3? And on a specific point, I think it's on page 49 of your report, or page 79 of our big bundle. There's an action about the completion of, well, they were called return to work interviews, I think they're now called wellbeing welfare reviews, and that although a new process has been developed, it's not being used from the look of it. Is that a technical issue with the way the form works or the way the IT works, or is that more of a cultural issue about the recognition of the importance of these things out on operational stations when people have got a lot of other things to be doing?
Okay, thank you. I'll take question 1 first in terms of once we get our round 3 inspection report, if any outstanding issues from round 2 will be carried over into the consolidated inspection action plan, as the version before you today includes the outstanding actions from round 1, unless the actions in round 3 supersede similar actions from round 2, in which case they will be consolidated together. So the governance arrangements that we've got wrapped around the inspection activity mean that we don't lose anything from previous rounds if they are still in progress, such that we keep track of those as well. Return to work, welfare check reviews. Can you just remind me which page you're referring to?
It was, iPad switched itself off. It's 79 in the meeting bundle, or page 49 of the appendix report. I think it's item 30, item 35. I think it is in the plan.
Yeah, this was certainly discussed at the service leadership team yesterday, and work is ongoing to increase the rates of completion of the new welfare checks. So I know that action has been taken on the format of the electronic form which is used to complete those checks, and there's some further work going on to reinforce the importance of the welfare check to ensure that when people come back to work, they're fit to be back at work, or indeed when they've been off on an extended period, those checks are done prior to that individual's return to work, such that the relevant and appropriate provision can be put in place for their safe return to work. But beyond that, I don't have any further information unless colleagues can help me out with that.
I can help out a little bit on this one. So I think it's a combination of all of the factors that you mentioned. So there were some IT issues and there were also some process issues in terms of how that information was collated and recorded. So they are being addressed as we speak. I think there are also some cultural issues and also some working practice issues. The reason that we changed it, return to work interview is a phrase that's used throughout HR, so probably in your own authorities that's a phrase that's used. I think the feedback that we had from our workforce was that interview sounds quite punitive. It sounds like something that you have when you've done something wrong, and obviously that isn't what we're saying. We're actually saying we're interested in people's welfare and their well-being, and that is a genuine interest that we have. And what we want is that for people to be able to have that conversation with their immediate line manager, and we recognise that sometimes there are confidentiality or sensitivity issues why they wouldn't want to have that meeting with somebody else. What that does mean sometimes is if somebody's coming back to work and their line manager isn't working that day for various reasons, they might be on leave, there might be training, etc. There are then sometimes some lags in actually that meeting happening. So we're looking at that and engaging with staff, thinking, well, how can we address that? Because we want this to be a meaningful and a really positive thing, so that we can look at whether somebody needs any help or support within the workplace and how we do that. So there's sort of multiple angles that we're looking at to make sure that those interviews happen frequently, but it's not just a tick box exercise. It's not just about having something green in a target tracker. It is about making sure that that makes a cultural difference and that people know that their well-being is being taken seriously and being supported by their managers. I don't know whether that helps.
Thank you very much.
Any other questions? No. Well, thank you very much for the update. That's really helpful. Good. So moving on to item 10, which is the desktop review of employment cases for AFRS. And I think, Simon, you're starting with that one?
Yes, thank you, Chair. Members, good morning. Before I invite colleagues from One Legal to present the paper in front of you today, I thought I'd just take you on a little bit of a journey of why I commissioned this particular report earlier on in the year. So members, you'll be aware that from a staff survey in 2018, following an independent inspection on the organisation, we felt it was important that we reached out to staff to sort of get a sense of feeling of what it was like to work within our service, Avon Fire and Rescue Service. So we undertook that staff survey in 2018, and that triggered a range of actions following feedback from our staff. And we've been pretty much continually on that journey since that time, and also took a sense check of our direction of travel with our staff in 2020 and stroke 2021, when we also went out to our second staff survey. And members, you'll be aware when you appointed me as your Chief Fire Officer, I also made accelerating our cultural journey as one of my 3 priorities. And how we make sure that we continue to make Avon Fire and Rescue Service a better place to work for everybody, an attractive employer and an employer of choice, and that when people come into the workplace they feel valued and they feel that they can contribute. And of course you will also be aware that there's been a focus on the sector through HMIC FRS, and in particular also media attention on several services around the country in relation to culture. I just want to sort of take you some of the actions that we've taken as a result from feedback from our staff. And some of those actions, I think before I go through those, it's important to say that culture is not an overnight change. It's a persistent and a consistent effort and journey of ongoing improvement and ensuring that we are mature as an organisation to listen and to respond accordingly from that. And that we've got a track record of doing that since 2018. Some of the things that we put into place is staff engagement forum, staff engagement network, so we continually have two-way engagement with our staff. We also, Pete referenced a charter there. We introduced a leadership charter. We refreshed our service values, and that was very much driven by our workforce around what values meant for them. We then followed that up with a behavioural framework. So what does good look like in relation to those values, and also what not so good looks like as well. So positive and negative behaviours in the workplace. We also then developed a leadership charter. We made a document called Making Avon Fire and Rescue Service a Better Place to Work, and we've since refreshed the leadership charter to rebrand that into Being the Best You Can Be, because we felt that it's about everybody doing their bit in the organisation and contributing to a better workplace. Alongside that, I launched a zero tolerance policy or statement alongside colleagues on the Service Leadership Board prior to Christmas, so late 2022. And we also launched a refresh of a dignity and respect policy as well, accompanied with a toolkit to be able to support our managers across the service to help them in how they lead their particular teams as well. So it's been quite a journey from that point, but it's also important that we maintain a focus on ongoing improvement, but ensure that we also learn lessons of the past. And members, I'm sure, will be aware of media attention on several services within the country and allegations of inappropriate behaviour amongst its workforce. So I wanted then to also, as part of that lessons learned, to understand how we can continually improve, how we can build confidence within our workforce, that if they raise issues or they're experiencing poor behaviour in the workplace, that we will take that seriously and they have the confidence that we'll deal with those proportionately and appropriately using our correct policies and procedures. And in doing so, we had the London Fire Brigade Cultural Report that was well published just before Christmas. And Pete has referenced the Spotlight report that the HMI released on the sector following evidence that they'd gathered in their round 2 inspections looking at the sector as a whole. This is something that I'd been planning for quite some time and discussing with the Service Leadership Board, and prior to the release of the Spotlight report and post the London Fire Brigade report, I commissioned a desktop review of all of our past discipline cases over a short period of time that was relevant and appropriate, that were relating to behaviours that were linked to allegations of gross misconduct. And therefore I felt it was important, in order to improve the future, that we take on board, and we're mature enough to take on board the lessons of the past, so that can influence how we can make those necessary improvements and can continually build the confidence across our workforce. And so therefore, colleagues, we commissioned One Legal to do that desktop review, to look at all of the evidence that we had in all of the investigations that were linked to allegations of gross misconduct. And the paper in front of you, members, also reports on the findings of independent review with some recommendations and how we can learn from those and take that forward. So with that, members, I'll hand over to colleagues of One Legal. Thank you.
Thank you. So just a reminder, One Legal is actually a shared legal services for 4 of the councils in Gloucestershire. We also provide specialist legal advice to other public bodies, which is why we were commissioned to do this particular piece in employment law. Sarah Faruqi is a specialist in employment law. Together with another lawyer within the team, they have undertaken this piece of work for the service. We were instructed back in February, actually, before the Spotlight review was published, and I think that needs to be recognised, that this was a proactive step that the service has taken to actually look at what's happened before, what can we learn for the future, how can we do things differently. So that was really, the foresight was good. And actually, as Pete mentioned, this further inspection, the thematic inspection that is going to be coming your way, again, you're well placed, you're ahead of the curve by doing this piece of work. We looked at disciplinary cases over the last 2 years, and within the report, we've picked out various recommendations. I will say the report that follows it has a lot of the recommendations already underway or implemented, and I think none of the recommendations we came up were a surprise to the leadership team. They were all things that they were aware of. But again, what we're suggesting is that there are a lot of processes, training, systematic issues that really, if you strengthen those, it makes it much easier to navigate any disciplinary process. I'll hand you over to Sarah, who will take you through some of the detail.
Thank you. Just for purposes again, my name's Sarah Faruqi. I'm the Head of Law at One Legal for litigation and planning. Although it doesn't say so on the tin, employment law is one of my areas of specialism. I've worked in private practice, in public service for over 25 years, doing employment cases and doing litigation, so that's investigations, prosecutions. So that's sort of the context of it. My colleague Rachel Baldwin, who undertook some of the reviews with me, she's been in local government nearly as long as I have, I think, and has helped out on a number of employment matters that I've been involved in, which has included high-level investigations of senior officers. So when we were asked to undertake the review, we worked with Karen initially to sort of filter out the cases. So we got a lot more to start off with, but we worked with Karen and said, well, these are the ones that we want to concentrate on because these are the ones about values rather than, I don't want to sound too dismissive, but some of the other day-to-day employment matters that sort of come up. So that narrowed it down to sort of 11 cases. And the desktop review was us being provided with all of the paperwork in respect of it. What we didn't do was interview anybody, whether they were a complainant or the person who was being complained of. We didn't do that. We just looked at the paperwork, the statements, the panels. We listened to all of the recordings on interviews and the disciplinary panels. And what I would say is, with anything like that, it is always easier, I think, especially as a lawyer, to sit and look at these things from a high with the benefit of hindsight and the benefit of actually looking at it from start to finish, rather than being the person who's undertaking the investigation or the panel. Hindsight is a wonderful tool to have. As we set out in the executive summary, there were a number of cases, and 5 in particular, where our conclusion was that the service didn't adopt best practice in terms of undertaking the investigation and therefore the disciplinary finding. Now, we're not saying at the conclusion of that, if it had been done differently, that you would have necessarily made a finding of gross misconduct and dismissal. What we're actually saying is you didn't get it right in terms of the practice there, so actually it's difficult for us to conclude one way or the other whether the finding was correct. So in terms of the findings as well, what we adopted was the practice that an employment tribunal would do, and it's a term that we had to explain whether it is within the sort of realms of reasonable decision making. It wasn't for us to say, well, in that case you imposed a written warning of 12 months and we would have done 8 months or 13 months. What we were looking at, broadly speaking, is whether that is correct. And on many of the cases, we did find that. We did recommend some lessons learned on those cases, even when we said the outcome was reasonable. But I would say that again, is the ability of a lawyer to sit there with the benefit of hindsight and nitpick on process a little bit. But I think they are valuable because I think having this review, as you've done, is useful because it gives you the time and the opportunity to actually reflect. And I would say, for the officers who are involved in these cases, it is very difficult at the time. You will get lots of information, and in particular on the 5 that we had, where there were concerns raised about behaviours, so whether it was sexist or homophobic behaviour, they are sometimes very difficult to frame and to investigate because it's not always straightforward that this happened and that is the outcome. So, you know, the recommendations that we've made, I think, as has been pointed out, is part of your journey to get to a point where if you get another complaint going forward, you have the tools and mechanisms to investigate those properly and hopefully restore confidence in your sort of processes. Because I think one of the conclusions I would say is that if things don't get investigated properly, it undermines confidence in, you know, you as an employer, let alone whether you get to an employment tribunal. It undermines that because people feel that I will raise something, it's not investigated properly, so what is the point? So that's where we've come from. So in terms of the recommendations, we sort of grouped them together as you've got in there. And broadly speaking, we divided them up into raising concerns. So we made 4 recommendations, and that is about process. In a couple of the cases that we reviewed, people sort of said, well, they raised the concern with their station manager, or they weren't confident, or the station manager or the watch manager then made a comment about what they were saying, and that undermined them. So again, it's about having a process and you're there and making sure that staff are aware of those processes, that if they feel uncomfortable about raising it with their immediate line manager or their immediate line manager is involved in it, where do they go from there? The next heading that we've got was in relation to complaints and investigation handling. And, you know, we looked at this, and as I said, it is very, very difficult because sometimes these investigations are not straightforward. They are very, very complicated, and they take time and resource to properly do them. But our recommendations broadly are that you get the toolkits in place, you get the training in place, you get the right people in place, because I think there's always this assumption that when you move up a structure, it's a bit like assuming that lawyers automatically are good managers. It's not necessarily the same sort of skill set, and what we would say is your investigators need to understand what skills they need and then have the support to do that. So there are a number of sort of more specific recommendations that we've made in relation to that, and I think, as you've noted, some of those are definitely in hand. And then the other sort of broad umbrella of recommendations were to do with organisational development, and in particular just looking at things like your policies to make sure that they meet best practice, that they are up to date. So, for example, in a disciplinary policy, it is clear on what is and what isn't acceptable in relation to perhaps behaviours outside of the workplace. How will you deal with those? How will you deal with issues on things like suspension? And also then one of the things that we did pick up from some of the cases was this sort of thing, well, it was banter. Well, I think it's about making sure that your staff, your managers, your organisation understand what is the difference between banter and bullying and where you overstep that line, and having sort of clear policies and training and induction into that may address some of the concerns that were raised in the cases that we had. And sort of finally on this, I think, looking at Karen over there, you know, the one recommendation, which is 13, which we've made, is about making sure that this is resourced. From experience, I can say that investigations take up a huge amount of time and effort, and if you don't resource that properly, I think there is a danger then that actually you get to the end of it and actually nobody's happy. And I can say, although it's great for lawyers, if you get into employment tribunals, they can be and are often extremely expensive, not only in terms of having the correct legal representation, but then also in terms of damages against you financially and reputationally as an organisation. I don't suspect, although lawyers love hearings, that you particularly want to be at an employment tribunal having all of this sort of dealt with in a public forum. So that's a sort of very quick overview of the report, and I'm happy to take any questions on it.
thank you. It's really interesting reading it. So, great. Questions? Richard?
Firstly, can I thank Simon, Shazia and Sarah for that very insightful report and summary. I've got 4 questions which perhaps you can answer as we go through them. The first is the simplest one. This report doesn't have a normal cover report, so I'm assuming, are you asking us, or the officers asking us, to formally receive the report or to endorse the recommendations?
So, Councillor, we wanted to put this in front of you to give you an update of where we are, the work that we are doing, so to give you some assurance and reassurance, if you like, around some of the steps we are taking for our cultural journey. Obviously, the recommendations are independent. They are what they are, and we'll take those forward and look at those. But we felt that rather than a covering paper, it was better to present this in front of members so you were, cited on some of the work that is ongoing at this moment. There are some of the things in a later paper that Karen will cover in the next paper around the Spotlight report that actually will relate to some of the aspects within the independent One Legal report, so that might help answer your question.
So without putting words in your mouth, we're formally receiving the report file.
That's correct.
The second query is, obviously you've done a desktop review of disciplinary cases over the last 2 years. From your experience, and obviously I know how you're founded by the 4 councils, and obviously you're primarily dealing, I guess, with public sector bodies, would you say the number of cases you found of disciplinary nature relative to our numbers of the organisation are typical, worse or better?
I think compared to local authorities, you are slightly higher, but I think that probably reflects your workforce in that the fact, I would imagine, you've got a slightly different demographic than, say, for instance, Tewkesbury Borough Council, where we are based, is a very different dynamic in terms of that. But you are not unique. We have cases from various organisations that highlight similar issues and behaviours within that, so you are not unique. Looking briefly at other fire services, I don't think your case numbers are particularly high compared to others that we looked at.
Thank you for that. My third query relates to recommendation 3, which talks about, where appropriate, engaging independent persons. Now, proportionately, what proportionately of the cases you've looked at do you think this could have been appropriate? And roughly, how long is a piece of string? What do you imagine the possible rough financial cost could be for the authority?
Looking at the cases, I can think of at least 2 or 3 where I think you would have benefited potentially from having somebody independent looking at it because of the nature of the complexity of what was being complained about. In terms of how much that would cost, I think that is how long's a piece of string. An investigation would be complex, and to do it properly, and depending on who you ask, it would take a considerable amount of work.
From memory, I think you are looking at having an independent recourse anyway, and I think I saw some figures somewhere in one of the papers. Is it yours, Karen? Okay, so we'll pick that one up.
Fine. The fourth one, and the last one you'll be relieved to hear, is, to be honest, most of your recommendations, I think I don't have an issue with. In fact, almost all, clearly they're aiming to produce a decent workplace, working employer, and that's what we should all be doing. Now, recommendation 12, which talks of regular feedback, I don't have a problem with that if it is feedback, but I'm a bit suspicious that there may be room in there for it actually to morph into, people passing on information which it could actually lead to discipline action against other people, somewhat akin actually to the former East German secret police, So I'm perfectly happy if it's what it says, but I just caution, I hope it doesn't develop from that.
Yeah, thank you, Councillor. There are a couple of things within that recommendation. I think Karen may well cover some of those in her next paper, because there's some correlation between the recommendations from One Legal, the Spotlight report, and some of the work that Karen is also focusing on at this moment in time. But in terms of reach back into the service, right the way across the service, a couple of areas that we have been exploring for a while now. One is the reporting back of discipline cases back into the service, the outcome of discipline cases, and how we publish that, because that can have a tendency to reduce rumours, conjecture, etc. Obviously recognising confidentiality with all of that is very important as well. And more regular reach back into the service aligned to our service values. I liken it perhaps to, and excuse the terminology, kind of a happiness survey. And it's a quick, simple touch base. How are things feeling for you this month, this quarter, so we can get that sense check back from the organisation. But of course, we also have our staff engagement network that meets regularly on a monthly basis, and we have the chair of the staff engagement network is part of our senior leadership team. They're not a senior leader, but they sit around that table. So that's another reach back into the service around a sense check, as well as local managers, encouraging local managers to engage with their teams. And from a senior leadership team and senior leadership board perspective, we now, and for quite some time now, about the past 4 years, have had a regular programme of visits back into every single workplace for that two-way engagement. So we do get a reasonable sense check of how things are for our staff and the experiences they're having in the workplace. But of course, we also need avenues for confidential reporting, which Karen will cover in the next paper as well.
Any other questions? Yes.
It's just a brief one, really. I was really interested to see the section on complaint and investigation handling, where we talked about the people that were actually carrying out the investigation, not necessarily having the experience to do so, and specialist training being provided to managers in the future, which I think is really, really important. That the people that are doing investigations should be fully understanding what they're actually doing. But the bit I really wanted to talk about was recommendation 13, which said, given the recommendations within this report, I would like to see something there that talks about ongoing review to ensure the continued effectiveness of the actions that you recommended. Yeah.
Thanks, Councillor. We will report back, particularly for the Spotlight report that we referenced earlier, which a lot of these recommendations have been brought into now. Karen will be briefing you in the next paper, but it's certainly our intentions to keep coming back to the members to give you regular updates on our progress against not just the Spotlight report. We report that back into HMI as well, anyway, through a portal, but also the recommendations which One Legal have provided within this paper in front of you as well.
Okay, any other questions? No? Well, thank you very much for the report. It's really interesting to read, and I'm sure we'll be using that moving forward. So thank you. Okay, moving on to item 11. Karen, I think that's yours, the progress report.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, councillors. So you've heard quite a lot this morning already in terms of both the HMI report and the report from One Legal. So I'll try not to duplicate things in my presentation, but you will see that some things do overlap. So I think it is really important to note that HMI are responsible for inspecting 44 fire and rescue services, and the evidence that they've produced in the Spotlight report is based on evidence that they've gathered from at least half of those services, and also from calls that they've had from employees within those services who've reported a number of instances of inappropriate behaviour, which they've put under three main headings, which is bullying, harassment and discrimination, a lack of fairness and diversity, and also reporting and handling of the concerns, including allegations of misconduct, which you've just heard from my colleagues at One Legal. I think what I will say at the outset is it was quite, I very much welcomed when the Chief asked for this independent review, but it's always a bit difficult, isn't it, when you're having your own homework marked and wondering what is going to happen when an external organisation looks at all of the cases. The reason that we sent so many cases through is what I really like about working for Avon Fire and Rescue Service is that we are transparent. So it was better that I sent all of the cases through to One Legal, and that they made a judgment then on which cases they felt met the criteria to warrant a sort of deeper dive and a review. So I think that for me shows that we want to learn lessons, and we also want to improve and continually improve. I welcome that they said it is quite complicated, but I think this is something that we do need to make sure that we get right as a fundamental part of being a good organisation. That HMI talked within their main Spotlight report about reference that inappropriate behaviours exist throughout society, and no workplace is immune from bullying and harassment or discrimination, unfortunately. I hope to work in a world one day when that isn't the case, but I think from the working in HR for over 30 years, I've found in many organisations similar issues that we're dealing with in the fire and rescue service. But equally, it's right that we don't say it's not happening here and that it's only happening in other fire and rescue services. Whilst I believe that the number of cases that we have is relatively small, but I think it's always interesting to benchmark against other organisations. Normally it's around about 1.5% of our organisation in terms of the cases that we have each year. We've got about 870 employees, and we have around about 15 discipline cases a year. Some of them obviously far more complex and more detailed and involved, and some of them at more minor level. So I very much welcome both the Spotlight report and also the work that has been done by One Legal. In terms of when the Spotlight report came out at the end of March, the board obviously considered the full content of that report along with human resources and other colleagues such as the DICE team, and looked at how do we make sure there's a lot of work to be done within the report. Some of it we're already making good progress on, that we've been doing it as part of our cultural surveys for back to 2018. But it was important that we do resource it appropriately, and I really welcome the fact that the Chief decided to appoint me into the role to lead this work. What I will say at the outset is I'm not doing this on my own. This is about all of us within the service working together on improving our culture, and I've been really impressed with the amount of support that I've had, both from my colleagues in the DICE team, in our corporate communications team, but also from people like the Fire Brigade Union. Most of our operational staff are members of the union, and it's really important that we work closely together and try and make sure that the messages are filtering out. We've mentioned about policies and procedures, and obviously that's part of the issue, good training and all of that, but it's also about making sure those things are embedded, and how can we work with staff to make sure that all of our policies and processes translate into really good practice and something making a difference within the workplace. So we've talked about sustained cultural improvement, and unfortunately I think the HMI, the way they've put the Spotlight report together is to maintain impetus. I don't think every fire and rescue service is maybe as far forward on the journey as we are. So there were some very challenging deadlines in there, and you will note that many of the deadlines had we got the report end of March, and lots of the deadlines had to be achieved by the 1st of June. I had my interview with HMI on the 11th of July, so a couple of weeks ago, and we had quite an interesting discussion around whether something should be marked as complete or not, because as the Chief indicated earlier, cultural improvement, genuine, sustained cultural improvement is ongoing. I can't just say that these things are complete on the 1st of June and then move on to doing something else. This is about we've made some good progress, and the appendix that you see will show some of the progress that we've made. But this is just to reassure all of you, this is constantly going back and looking at these actions and seeing how we can do better and how we can continually improve. So we had a presentation yesterday at the senior leadership team and also a development session, particularly looking at misogyny and sexism within the fire and rescue service, and working with our senior leadership team as to how we can learn the lessons and continually do that work to make sure that we're making that difference across the service. So as outlined by my colleagues at One Legal, they've done their desktop report, they've produced their recommendations. I think it's really important to say we do welcome those. We embrace all of the things. There wasn't any surprises there, which was encouraging to know, but also I think it is something that we need to make sure is embedded. So I think definitely some of the things around the training of our staff. We have had some issues. So we've done quite a lot of training. We've done some training with ACAS, who is seen as the industry sort of best practice. That's very much about foundation level training. So that's helping our managers to understand the legal principles of what constitutes a good investigation and a thorough investigation, how to assimilate the evidence, make sure there aren't any gaps. But what we recognise is that our managers are really busy people. They're trying to spin many, many plates, and that maybe they're not experts in these things. So sometimes just doing one training exercise is not sufficient. So we've been looking at for quite some time about how do we make sure that we engage with those managers and make sure the managers at the lowest level in the organisation, so our supervisory managers, are able to have the confidence and the competence to deal with issues at the lowest level. So there's a lot of training that we need to do in terms of coaching and mentoring of staff, and also making sure that the HR team get out and about on station. So I've been going out, meeting with staff on a regular basis to actually start to have those conversations around what does training look like? What kind of training do you want? Because sometimes people like myself and Richard will sit and we'll develop training and think that we know what the workforce wants, but actually sometimes there is a disconnect there. So it's very much about talking to our workforce and then what will make a difference for them. And also what we talked about the courage to speak up and having that initial conversation that people have within their workplace being received in a really positive way. So those junior officers, or indeed their allies, their colleagues. So sometimes this doesn't need a manager to take action to improve the culture. It's about having allies that will help somebody to raise something or identify something that's inappropriate and deal with that in a sort of a sort of more robust way than maybe has happened in the past. So I think that for sustained cultural change, it is a role for everybody, including elected members. And I know that we've got a lot of new elected members here before. Sometimes even the words, like we call it sometimes microaggressions, so things like the use of the word fireman, that has been used in this forum previously, and I've been criticised, quite rightly so, by my colleagues for not picking up and addressing that. And actually the term is firefighter. We've used the term firefighter for many, many years now. That's the correct phrase to use. So I think it's things like that that all of us need to catch ourselves and just think that every action that we're doing, our language is so important, our behaviours are so important, both within the workplace, but also you touched upon outside of the workplace. That's within the communities that we serve, but also on social media, if we're out, whenever we're wearing the name of Avon Fire and Rescue Service. So very recently we went to the Pride March in Bristol, we went to Bristol Carnival. We're representing the service, so our behaviours have to be exemplary at all stages. And our code of ethics that the National Fire Chiefs Council is really clear on that, and you'll see within the action plan, it's around trying to make sure that is absolutely embedded, that it isn't just words that are on a poster or in a policy, that our staff really understand that and engage with that. So I just thought it's just worth sort of mentioning that for all of us, it's something that is something that we need to do and that is embedded on a day-to-day basis. So in terms of engagement of staff, you mentioned or asked a question specifically on that, Councillor Eddy, in terms of how we get engagement from our staff and in terms of feedback. So the chiefs spoke about that in terms of some of the things that we're doing. We're also looking at mini regular surveys. So when the chiefs are saying about happiness surveys, so that get a benchmark of where we are, we want to make sure it's confidential and so people can't be easily identified, but also that we gather enough information to identify where there may be pockets of bad behaviour or inappropriate behaviour that need more focus. And that might be because there's new leaders within that service that needs some help and support and some concerted training. There may have been a lot of changes within those teams that lead to some changes in culture. So it's just trying to make sure that when we get those surveys back, that we can actually act upon those and use that in a really meaningful way. I've also been out, and as I mentioned earlier, I'm talking to the Fire Brigade Union, really encouraged by the work that they want to do with us. They also get calls from staff who are sometimes struggling with things that are happening within their workplace and not quite sure how to do it. So it's how can we join up. The Dignity and Respect toolkit that we issued helps because that enables people to have a look at the toolkit and see what's help and support is available to them. But it's around making sure that when I've gone out and talked to fire stations recently, I was asked, for example, on a few stations I've been to come along and talk for half an hour on the Spotlight report. I ended up being there for over 3 hours on all of those station visits, which is brilliant because whilst I was slightly cautious when I first got there as to why is the head of HR coming out to talk to us about culture and we're going to have to be really careful about what we say, actually they led to really, really interesting conversations where people were able to be really frank, really open and honest about what's happening well within the service, because I do believe we've got a positive culture in the vast majority of our workplaces. But there are some people that have had some difficult times, and particularly some of the cases that you've looked at have been people that have had some really difficult times within our workplaces. And some of those conversations that we had about some of the legacy cases, so the Chief mentioned about rumours, I think that we keep things confidential, but sometimes people will talk about cases, and so having those frank and open conversations and saying, well, what can we do differently? How can we stop that case being a legacy case where sometimes things have maybe built up over a period of time and people haven't felt either confident or supported to raise those things at the outset. So I think those conversations are really starting to bear some fruit, and it's about collating all of that information and looking at how does that educate, what else do we do in terms of our training, etc. In terms of, I'm just trying to pick out of some of the other recommendations that One Legal have recommended. I think the confidential way to raise concerns, so we've got a new confidential reporting line which will be set up on the 28th of August. It's with Crime Stoppers, which is an organisation which has tried and tested experience in dealing with confidential reports for both the police, for many charities and many other large organisations nationally. And we're working with our corporate communications team at the moment to make sure that we publicise that to staff so that they're aware that if they feel for whatever reason that they're not able to raise something within the service through the various mechanisms that we've got. At the moment we've got a lot of things that are available to people in terms of their line manager, the HR team, the Equalities DICE team, the Fire Brigade Union, and other teams as well. If they really feel that they've been unable to raise that within the organisation, having that independent confidential reporting line I think will really help. It's something else that they can either give their name and give the information about their workplace that they're in, or they can do it truly anonymously, and they'll be given a PIN number, and then they'll be able to go onto a portal and get progress reports of the developments of that case. So that case will come back into the service. It will only come to members of the board. It won't be seen by anybody else. It will be seen by one of the directors, and they will make a decision on what happens with that case in terms of investigation. Picking up on another point in terms of the skill of the investigators, we have got a preferred supplier list. So we've gone out to the market and we've looked at a number of suppliers who can help and support us with doing investigations. We already have one supplier, and for the very complex cases we have sort of tried and tested sort of practice of using external organisations to do investigations. The costs do vary, so I've sort of gone out to the market and tried to drive a hard deal and get the best prices that I possibly can. But it's also about the quality of the service and the speed of making sure that we do these investigations at speed. But also sometimes it is important that investigators have the context of the fire service. So an example being that one of the investigators, external investigators, recently said, well, I think that was impossible that the manager wouldn't have known about that. They must have known about that behaviour happening. When they actually went to the fire station and saw how vast that station was, saw the number of different buildings, the yard, the training areas, etc., they then started to get that context. And, well, actually, if that was an isolated, one comment that had been made, it's quite reasonable and possible that that manager wouldn't have heard about that. So we're looking at sort of maybe a blended approach where we use external investigators, but maybe also with one of our own internal investigators, and whether that's from an operational side of the business or whether it's from a corporate manager, so you get that different perspective, because I think that's also important, where you maybe have sometimes a mixture of gender, mixture of age, mixture of races, so depending on the nature of the case, that you appoint your investigators accordingly. That also enables that training to happen, so that they might do that initial training, but then they learn on the job if you speak with an external investigating team, and that builds us that sort of added experience within that investigation pool. In terms of giving people confidence in terms of raising things, I think I've covered that in terms of the confidential reporting line, but it's also some of the things that the Chief was talking about in terms of how do we then communicate the learning from those cases. What has happened? The rumours get out there, and sometimes they're correct, sometimes not, and sometimes people can make a judgment based on the small amount of information they might think they know about that case. So we're looking at how do we make sure that we communicate lessons learned from cases and the actions that were taken to give people greater confidence, because sometimes people say, well, what is the point of raising something because I don't think anything's going to get done about it. Well, actually we do things about it, and we need to get more effective in communicating that, but also protecting the confidentiality of those involved. So it's always a bit of a balance there to make sure that we get that right. In terms of governance, in terms of picking up on your point, in terms of monitoring the allegations, so every other senior leadership team meeting I go along and monitor both the report from the Spotlight report, but also my colleague Alison, who's currently the head of HR. She's looking at all of the discipline and grievance cases, and we will have those conversations. We also have development sessions within our senior leadership team. So we look at real cases. So we had one recently where we looked at a case as it developed, and we broke the senior leadership team up into groups, and we looked at, well, what would you have done in that case? What do the policies say? What extra information would you have needed? And we sort of looked at it through as a real sort of case study to try and give people more confidence, and also to have the conversations, because sometimes people will have a different view in how to deal with cases, and we can learn from each other. So that work in terms of the monitoring is ongoing, and I would very much welcome the fact to be able to come back to you at the next meeting and give you a further progress report on the actions that are taken. So I think in summary, we're doing a lot. There's a huge amount I think we should be proud of within the service in terms of the cultural journey that we're on, but we still recognise that there are some further areas where we need to focus on, and I think the One Legal report and recommendations has helped us to know that we are going in the right direction, but there are some things, particularly I think around training, that is probably an added area of focus for us over the next couple of months. And I'll leave it there in case anyone's got any questions.
Members, there are a number of recommendations with both in the Spotlight report and also in the One Legal, as you've seen. There are some key dates within the Spotlight report for delivery, and Karen's been working towards the delivery of some of those dates. Some were the 1st of June, so we've been prioritising some of the actions to deliver against that, some in October and some in 2024. And of the 34 recommendations within the Spotlight report, some were directly related to each Chief Fire Officer to deliver. Some were related to police and others related to the National Fire Chiefs Council as well. So there's quite a mixture, but there are key delivery time dates for us to deliver against, which Karen has been reporting back to the HMI on our progress from that perspective. But just bringing back to the paper itself, and it hopefully answers, Councillor Eddy, your question earlier on in relation to the previous report, is the recommendations are ask the Policy and Resources Committee approve the progress made against the HMIC FRS Spotlight report, which Karen has talked through there, about those recommendations, and the plans to address the recommendations in the one legal review of historic employment cases. So that's, in essence, trying to bring the two together, members, hence why you didn't have a covering paper. I felt it was important to have space for discussion separately for that particular element. So that brings it together, asking members for those approve those recommendations. Thank you. Thanks, Chair.
Thanks, Simon. Steve, you've got a question.
Yeah, just a few points. Thank you for that, Cam. There's obviously a huge amount going on with this. I think it would be really helpful if we had a single action plan in a similar format to Peter's one for the HMI report, so we can see, well, it won't be at a glance because it'll be a big plan, but everything that's going on, both what's already happening and what's planned for the future, because I'm assuming we're going to see this again, and it'd be helpful to be able to track progress against that in a similar way to what we do with the HMI one, and that would also have the added advantage of putting it all in the public domain, so our staff can see it as well. I've got three bits, and I'll... Yeah, go for it.
So the HMI have produced their own tracking action plan. Unfortunately, it is quite unwieldy, and there a 300-word narrative against each action. So because I know how much paperwork you have and how much reading material you have, I tried to condense it into the version in front of you today. And also I suppose to try and present one version that is used, both this is a version that was produced yesterday for the senior leadership team, and also to make sure that you were updated on it, and also this is the one that I use for staff. But I absolutely, if you would prefer to see the full version, I'm more than happy to make sure that I share that with you next time around.
Yeah. I think it would be, I mean, I get HMI do their own thing, and that covers everything that's happening that might be relevant to Avon or not. So I think it would be helpful to see what we are doing as a service, what the service is doing against both the HMI recommendations and the one legal ones, so we can see it together.
Yeah, thanks, Councillor. Yeah, so we're actually going to take the opportunity of the next round of HMI to review and revisit how we currently report in. So the HMI report is very, very kind of detailed, isn't it, and sometimes quite tactical. So we want to streamline that so you have the high-level things that you need, and also combine that with a spotlight and one legal. And of course, this also links to the work that we're doing on performance framework and also corporate health. So we will be looking at how we report to you, but on various different kind of layers according to your needs.
Yeah, sure. And I think that would be great if that is or this work is included in that bigger picture of how we see all this stuff together.
Indeed.
The second point I wanted to make is that, of course, we need to track all of these actions, but action obviously isn't the same thing as achievement. And I wonder if it might be worth, at an appropriate point, it might be 18 months, 2 years down the line, inviting one legal to come back and look again and see if things have changed from what they found the first time round.
I'm sure one legal to welcome that recommendation. But,
or maybe I should say inviting an appropriate supplier subject to, etc., etc.
Yeah, of course, Councillor,
to do all that again. And the third point, just picking up on what Ron mentioned, and we've heard about investigation skills, it just occurs to me we're sat in our shared headquarters with Avon and Somerset Police. They're people who know a fair amount about doing investigations. I wonder if there's some scope for sharing skills there with our own managers to support them in that work.
So ever since we moved to service headquarters, we've been having regular dialogue with our counterparts in human resources within the police. Normally they're quite tight on resources as well, so sometimes they haven't had the capacity to be able to free up resources. But what we are doing is we're also linking in with their professional standards team. So one of the recommendations in the Spotlight report is to work with the police in terms of how can we learn lessons from their professional standards team, and how do they sort of liaise with their HR teams to make sure that they dovetail in terms of the information they share. I also think that from our training perspective, again, if there are some things that they do well for their training for their investigators, I'm sure there will be some sort of lessons we can learn and some things that we can borrow from the police in terms of some good practice training materials that we could utilise.
Perfect, thank you.
Thank you. I've found this really interesting. So thank you to One Legal and to Karen and your team. And Philippa, you've got a question.
Thank you. Yes, it's really, really interesting, really useful. Get some feedback. I'm not 100% sure this is relevant, but I just wanted to ask what the sort of preventative measures would look like on the ground for, a junior firefighter. What would they see that's different to prevent the microaggression and bullying and so on?
Great question. So when we recruit any new firefighters, which are the bulk of our workforce, both myself and Richard go along to their induction programme to give them training and awareness on behaviours and values and what is acceptable and is not acceptable in the workplace. And we have a lot of very candid conversations. It's not just about us standing up and giving a presentation on the Equality Act. Whilst that is very important aspect, it's about what does a good workplace look like? Why should they have joined Avon Fire and Rescue Service, and why is it an employer of choice and a safe space for people to work? But also the other important aspect of that is to get our faces and names out there, so that if people have any concerns that they feel that when they get out on their workplace that they haven't been able to raise within their local staff group, that they can come and talk to us, that they've met us right at the outset. They also have induction sessions with the Fire Brigade Union as well, and that's why it's really important that we're working together so that nobody feels isolated. So for example, particularly if you're in an underrepresented group, you may be the only female firefighter on that watch or the only black firefighter on that watch. And it's really important that if they feel isolated that they have somebody to go to, but also we're working with others to make sure we've got allies. So we talk quite a lot about the importance of being an ally. Don't leave it to the female firefighter to raise something and say that was inappropriate. All of their workforce should be supporting them with that. And that's an ongoing piece of work, but that seems to be quite successful at the moment. And again, it's about getting feedback from people to say whether that has worked effectively and what else can we do. So yesterday we had a session within our senior leadership team, and there were people that have female firefighters there who have talked about their own experience. So again, it's about going around and saying how can we use that experience to make sure that doesn't continue to happen in the workplace, and how can we work in a joined up way to make sure that people feel able to raise things and have a really positive experience. Does that answer the question?
Okay, well, thank you anyway, both of you. Now, yes, sorry, carry on.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, Karen, and obviously legal team. Very interesting report, quite a lot of hard work, seems like, put it behind. And one thing I notice, which is really good, like how you empathize on members' training and the managers who handling these procedures. But I would like to know what sort of things are in place to access or regular assessment of those managers and members who are conducting these investigations. Like there will be a training, but how often are we going to access their knowledge? Is there anything in place for that? Thank you.
So at the moment, all of our cases are monitored both by the Human Resources team, but also we have a role at the moment which we're going to look at as to whether we continue with the role. It's called a senior point of contact. So it's a senior manager. So for every serious or potentially gross misconduct case, then a member of the board would be the senior point of contact. And they are involved throughout the process, so they will be checking at every single stage to see about the speed of the investigation, about the quality, about the questions that are being asked, about the quality of the investigation report. So when it's a draft report, it will go into the senior point of contact to check. So those are all of the things that will make sure those cases get done appropriately, but also that we're learning lessons from that and also getting feedback from the investigators. And this, to be honest, has been something we maybe haven't done as well as we could have done, is that sometimes a case is done, the sanction or the discipline hearing has happened, and then you move on to something else. And it's as they mentioned earlier, it's about looking at the lessons to be learned and getting all parties in the room ideally together, or at least able to feed in the process. So the investigating officers, the presiding officers, the appeal officer if it went to an appeal, the member of HR that was involved, the member of the Fire Brigade Union maybe that was representing people, and getting those different perspectives so that we learn those lessons, and that continually is used to educate the training and the development that we use for those investigating officers. Does that help answer your question?
Okay, great. Well, I'm glad that's sparked quite a lot of questions and comments, and that's really, really good. Now, I've just looked at the agenda, and we've still got 4 very important items to get through, but we've been sat here for getting towards 2 hours now, and I think it might be really helpful if we had a 5-minute break and got up and walked around a bit so we can... Oh, sorry. Yes, right. Okay, my recommendation, which I think was to recognise and agree with the report. Approve progress made, yes. And I think from all the feedback we've had, it sounds very much like you have all agreed. So unless anybody says otherwise, we will take that as agreed. Yeah? Okay, thank you. Right, so going back to what I was proposing prior to that, I think it would help to refresh us if we just got up and had a quick 5-minute break. So then we can really concentrate, because we've got quite still some more very important items to go through. Okay? Right, so just take 5 minutes or so. Right, okay then, thank you very much for that. I just thought it was important before you actually started nodding off to make sure that you had a proper break for a couple of minutes. Okay, item 12, our next one is about the procurement forward plan. I hope I'm on the right one here, and that's Tanya.
Yeah. Thank you. Okay, hello everybody. I'm Tanya, and I'm the Procurement and Supplies Manager. And this document is the first time we're presenting it in any way, shape or form, so feedback very welcome. So when they had the governance review a little while ago, there were a number of changes made to the contract procedure rules and who gets to sign off what when. I'm sure when you really want to sleep at night, you'll want to read those contract procedure rules in detail, but in the meantime feel free to ask me anything you like. So part of that procedure was that this committee would want to see some of the procurements that are coming up in the future that may or may not happen. So I should put into context that this is a snapshot based, that's why it's got a snapshot and the date next to it, because it is a live document that moves, can move quite swiftly, can be quite dynamic about what goes in, what comes out, depending on funding, on priority changes, on just random things happening that all of a sudden you need to buy. So I'm just trying to put a little bit of context in that, and how what you see over the course of these meetings might change, or may not. They might stay very static. So the idea is that you wanted to see everything that had a contract value of £250,000 or more. So a contract value is the full value, so it's not the annual cost of something, it's the full value of the whole contract. So if a contract's in place for 4 years, it'll be whatever that costs us estimated over 4 years. If it's in for 10 years, etc., etc. So the list on your appendices is everything that is currently estimated to be over £250,000 in value. Various values, as you can imagine. And the ones in yellow are potentially ones that will come to this committee as a business case going forward, because they'll potentially be over £1 million in cost, which is what you will see going forward. You will have a business case presented to you about what we intend to do and have your chance to comment specifically on those procurements above that value. So really it's quite a short paper. I don't plan to really go in detail into any of these items at this forum. It's for information. It's to give you a bit of context about what's coming up. You feel free to ask me anything you'd like. Some things may be confidential, so I might not be able to mention those. And I can talk to you separately about that if necessary. But also feedback on whether this is the type of thing you want to see in your appendices. It's my first attempt, so I will advise that I am working on it and I'm trying to see how it's going to look better. I'm thinking about doing graphs and things in Teams, but we'll see how that goes in the future. But yes, I'll kind of over to you on just any questions before we go through to whether you want any changes made and recommendations. Okay, Richard?
Yeah, thanks for this. I appreciate it's not a budget paper, it's obviously a procurement paper. I previously asked questions about the proposed hovercraft and vehicle. Can you roughly remind me what we budgeted?
I believe it was in our capital programme and it was an estimated 800,000 maximum. We are just in the process or user group stage, so that's a very much pre-procurement stage, looking at what's out there, what trials are available, so no decision has been made yet about how we progress.
Sorry, can I just jump in? Tanya's right, our original estimate was around 800,000 for the hovercraft and for the vehicle to carry it. It's currently stated with the user group, and just as a bit of an update, with their preferred option currently, which hasn't progressed outside the user group yet, is considerably less than that.
Sorry, I thought we were looking in that direction. Just in terms of format, I think one page is perfect. I think one of the things we said in the governance review is we didn't want reams and reams of stuff that's just presented for information. I think it's helpful to see this on one page as it is. I'm not sure it needs to be agendaed for a big discussion at every meeting. I think it's helpful just to see it. One thing I guess I might want to add to it is some idea of contract value. And I appreciate it'll be a range, it's an approximation, that's fine, but it'd be helpful just to get a sense of that, I think.
No problem, and interesting to know people's views about, because I wouldn't normally have done a cover report going forward. I just think, but because it was the first time, I wanted to put some context around why you were guessing a random spreadsheet. But in future, yeah, I can just submit this and be available for questions, but we don't necessarily have to go into any depth if that's what people want to do.
When you go out to procurement, do you try to do that locally?
Yeah, so we have all sorts of criteria that we do about how we meet our they're called social value requirements. So yes, absolutely, we will look at all different ways of doing that.
Sorry, I haven't got my microphone on. Any other questions or comments? No? In that case, the recommendations are that we consider the procurement plan, that we agree no cover report is needed going forward, and standalone procurement plan is submitted in advance with other PRC papers. Head of procurement or deputy will be in attendance at PRC meetings to go through the plan and review and agree the content of the plan for future meetings. So, everybody in favour of that? Yep, great. Okay, thank you very much then. That's that one. And the next one is item 13, which I think, Richard, you're presenting this, is that right? Yeah, thank you.
Good morning, members and colleagues. This report, the Gender Pay Gap report, provides an update on the gender pay gap and ethnicity pay gap of a snapshot date of the 31st of March 2023. The committee is asked to note and approve the content of the Gender Pay Gap and Ethnicity Pay Gap report and approve the publication of the report. This is the 5th year reporting on the gender pay gap since the introduction of the mandatory requirement for private and public sectors to calculate and publish a gender pay gap. It is our 2nd time reporting on the ethnicity pay gap. As a fire and rescue authority, we come under the local government category of local government in Schedule 2 of the Equality Act 2010, Specific Duties and Public Authorities Regulations 217, and therefore required to publish our gender pay gap on the snapshot date of the 31st of March. The mean pay gap for gender in Avon Fire and Rescue Service this year shows a negative gap of 3.37% in favour of male staff. This is an increase in the pay gap between men and women in the service compared to 2022, when we recorded a positive gap of 0.18% in favour of female staff. At the point of last year's pay gap snapshot, there was a higher representation of female staff in the mid-upper and mid-lower salary quartiles, and in 2021 there was a 2.5% increase of women in the higher quartile salary bands. In the same period, we saw a 2.5% decrease in men in the higher salary bands. Those were the changes in the workforce that resulted in the positive pay gap in 2022. However, this year, despite a 2.5% increase in female staff in quartile 4, the majority of male staff in this quartile are uniformed and received a 7% national pay award in 2023. In contrast to the majority of women in the same quartile who are corporate staff and received a lower national pay award in this period. An additional contributing factor in the changes in the gender pay gap is due to having an interim male treasurer imposed this year as opposed to a female treasurer last year, which accounts for the equivalent of about 1.5% change in the mean calculations. Although we've seen a widening of our pay gap this year, Avon Fire and Rescue Services pay gap still remains significantly lower than the national average, which has declined from 9.7% to 9.4%. However, we remain committed to reducing the pay gap between men and women in the service, and will continue to advance the quality of opportunity for our female staff by promoting development opportunities such as programs like Springboard, Spring Forwards, Stepping Up program, and a range of ILM courses which help in raising aspirations for stepping up into leadership roles. We'll also continue to use positive action initiatives to attract women into the service and to use people impact assessments to identify and remove all barriers to progression and opportunities. The ethnicity pay gap. To date, there is no legislation passed that requires public bodies to collect and analyse or publish information on our ethnicity pay gap. However, we have chosen to publish the results of our ethnicity pay gap this year to remain transparent and ensure that we are aligned with our service values. So this year, our analysis of our ethnicity pay gap has resulted in a minor reduction from 5.56% to 5.4% as of the snapshot date of 31st of March 2023. Although we've seen a slight increase in the percentage of ethnic minority staff in the service over the last 12 months, from 2.7% in 2022 to 3% in 2023, the overall numbers remain low. Underrepresentation of staff from ethnic minority backgrounds in our workforce adds complexity to the task of gathering analysing data. Along with a greater breakdown of classifications as compared to gender pay gap, required to provide meaningful insights about existing disparities and how to reduce them and remove them. Further analysis of our ethnicity pay has revealed that any movement in staff in the workforce, such as recruitment, resignations, promotions, assignments, for example, can lead to noticeable changes and spikes in the salary pay gap results. As with gender, we will continue to use positive action initiatives to attract people from ethnic minority communities into the service through our community engagement programs, recruitment events, and working closely with our key partners, such as Bristol City Council, Avon Somerset Constabulary, and SARI. Similar development opportunities, as mentioned before, with regards to women, will also be available for ethnic minority staff, and we will continue to identify and mitigate any inequalities and disparities in our policies and processes using people impact assessments and identify and remove all barriers to progression and opportunities. That's the end of my report. Any questions, please?
Thank you, Richard, for that. Whilst it's disappointing to see a one-year slippage for both ethnicity and for the gender pay gap, I appreciate the explanations you provided, and I personally think 1 year is quite a short period for actually and can be accounted by statistical blips. In my view, I think the direction of travel is more important, and perhaps next year we could have some comparative figures for over 3 years.
Sure.
Would that be helpful?
Yeah, definitely.
Just a couple of points for kind of clarification, and also your point, Councillor Ellie, in terms of that comparison with 3 years. So I think first point here is just a reminder for members that these data and figures refer to the difference between what we call including green and grey book. So therefore your operational and your uniform staff and your corporate staff. So your very senior salaries, so our service leadership board salaries aren't included in these calculations as gold book. So just to clarify that point, because I know you've kind of taken a previous paper. The other one in terms of the point is that, of course, it is disappointing that we have an increase in our gender pay gap this year for the reasons that have been explained. But also to emphasise one of kind of Richard's points is that does equate, as you will see on page 134, to the difference in our average hourly rate of pay. That's not an easy thing to kind of say, of 60 pence. So that's what we're talking about in terms of the figures involved here. And also, yes, it's difficult to predict where we were with the next year, because in terms of the Green Book staff, which we say is our corporate staff, of which the majority is female, the latest information is that the pay offer has been rejected. That was for on average for us of around 4%. The pay is kind of tiered according to what your grade was. That was the offer, and that's been turned down at 4%. So we don't yet have an indication of what the pay awards will be for Green over the year 23-24 to have a prediction about where we might be in terms of going forward for those figures. And then the final point, Councillor, is we report it on an annual because that's what our legislation requirement is. However, we have, of course, previous papers which show that 3-year trajectory, so we can add that to the paper next time. Thank you.
Thanks. Just a thought that just occurs to me. An additional helpful way of understanding this might be, at least for uniformed staff, to have a breakdown by rank of both for gender and ethnicity. So it gives us because that's essentially what the pay gap is telling us, isn't it? It's a seniority gap. And it might be a helpful way of helping us to understand and see the picture, if we can express it that way.
That would need to be, I guess, maybe appendix to the report. There is guidelines in terms of what we report to overall workforce. So if that's a breakdown that members would like to see, it would have to be, I guess, a bit of an appendix as a side to publishing the gender pay gap.
You have to publish what's statutory, of course. Yeah.
And also we need to be a bit careful with that, because it's not just around grade or rank, it's also about numbers. So what you can see in the data that we have is actually our number of females in that quartile 4 has actually increased, but it hasn't over the last year. So we've got more people who are more senior in the service. However, that doesn't translate to a difference in pay gap because the majority of those are corporates. So it's the combination of the two. So I think we can look at having more narrative underneath and more data, but we need to be a bit careful because it isn't just about ranks and roles, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Any other comments?
It's quite complex, Council, because we have probably 4 different terms and conditions and employee groups, so trying to compare like for like is quite a challenging one, to be honest.
Yeah, I think that's a good point because it's quite a unique sort of organisation, isn't it? In that way, it's much harder to distinguish it. Right, any other questions, or are we... Right. Recommendation is that we note and approve the content of the gender pay gap and ethnicity pay gap report and approve the publication of the report. Is that okay, everybody? Okay? Yeah, good. Right, and the next one is the transformation programme update. And I think that's over to you, Ian.
Thank you, Chair. Good afternoon, members. The report I'm bringing to you today is a progress update on the Service Transformation Programme. So back in February 2021 at the Avon Fire Authority meeting, members approved funding for the Service Transformation Programme. It's a multi-year programme and is currently due to come to an end at the end of this financial year. At that same meeting, it was determined that regular updates would be brought before members, and this is the 9th such report in that series of updates. I've included in the report the key objectives. I'm conscious that not everybody on this committee perhaps has that information to them. So 3 key objectives for the programme. One is around digitalising our service, and that's looking at our hardware and software, and how we can make that work more effectively, reviewing our processes and procedures and streamlining and automating those wherever we can, and a review of all of our policies, and that's partly about kind of looking at how easy they are for people to use, stripping out procedure and guidance from the policy intention and producing those in a slightly different format, but also reducing the number of policies that we have. We started with around 80 policies, and the intention is that they will be reduced to around 50. Some of that is combining policies up, and some of it is about looking at some of those that we perhaps don't need any longer, they're not relevant, and removing those from service. And some of those are actually procedures and guidance rather than actual policies. Alongside the programme, funding was approved from reserves, so there was a sum for revenue and a sum from our capital programme as well to purchase things like new hardware and so on. Since the last update to members, there's been a number of movements within the transformation team resources due to a number of reasons. So the former head of transformation has been reassigned to another role. We have had one of our project managers has been promoted and moved out of the team, and one of our delivery officers has secured a post elsewhere in the service. So we have a few challenges that has created. It's a known risk that with any programme that has a finite time frame, that there will be the potential for some people to leave before it's ended. But we do have plans in place to manage and mitigate that as far as possible. And for those of you who have been at previous meetings or have read previous papers will know we've had some challenges around recruiting to digital roles over the course of the programme. And again, we've found ways to mitigate that. So a number of things we've done. We've upskilled some of our people within transformation to do some digital work. We also have a contract with an external IT provider, and there are some development days within that new contract were able to use some of those, and also some work packages that we're able to send to them. So we're kind of mitigating that, although that has been a real challenge, and it has delayed some of the work from the intended sort of timeline. In terms of the current performance around the work packages, we have 39 work packages within the programme covering those 3 different areas. 30 of those are on track or are complete. 4 are in an evaluation stage, so that's where we've implemented the change, and then we are evaluating the impact of that change that we've made. 3 are progressing with some issues, and 2 are on hold currently. I've included in Appendix 1 a dashboard that shows that spread, and I've also included a list of all of those work packages and the status for each of them. The programme remains on track, as I say, in many of those areas, but behind in some, and these changes to some of the resourcing is going to have some further impact on that. There have been some significant achievements, though, since the last report. We've built and launched a new communication help desk using Microsoft Teams, which we've migrated all personnel in the service to, and that's a fault reporting system for hardware. We have also, within the transformation team, piloted the migration of our files from a shared on-premises drive into the cloud, and now we're just working on a plan to migrate everybody else within the service across. So that will improve security and resilience, but it also makes it accessible from any device, anywhere, at any time. We've made some changes and improvements to the welfare return and self-certification digital form. We talked about that a little bit in one of the earlier papers. So that is really around reducing some submission failure. So we're using something called Power Apps, which enables us to check email addresses in the background, so there aren't any failures in terms of submission, which will help. And our combined scoping impact assessment form, which we launched some time ago now, has been through a further iteration to make it easier both for people to complete those impact assessments, but also for the subject matter experts to evaluate what's in them and provide relevant advice. We've also undertaken some bespoke SharePoint training. This is in relation to a new intranet and also a testing environment. And the transformation team is also providing project management support to that new intranet project. We also have a training program underway for Microsoft 365. So having failed to recruit externally, a member of our transformation team who's actually very skilled in all things digital and very good at explaining things to people as well, has been selected to spend part of his time going around the service, bringing everybody up to sort of the same standard of knowledge and capability and understanding, and I think also crucially sort of confidence in accessing it. We're moving more and more things into Microsoft 365 environment, so it's important that we take people with us on that. In terms of risk for the programme, there is a corporate risk that we review on a regular basis. It's currently a risk rating of 15, so that increased last time, if you recall. At the most recent review, it remains unchanged. Now, that's despite the fact that I've mentioned that a couple of people have left the team. However, we have just recruited and appointed and had an acceptance of a new project manager for the Firewatch upgrades, which make a difference. And we have also begun to recruit for a digital apprentice. And we have 3 really strong CVs in at the moment and interviewing very soon, and we're very confident that we will be able to appoint an apprentice. We've had 2 other apprentices within the transformation programme. One has gone on to become a delivery officer, and the other one is still undertaking her apprenticeship at the moment. And it's brilliant. It's a brilliant way of bringing people in. They really are super talented, and they've brought an awful lot to the programme and to the service in the work they've done so far. In terms of kind of risk mitigation of the programme itself, we have an amount of the original budget that will be left at the end of this financial year. So we have looked at what we think that will look like. We've also done some work to identify the work packages that won't have been completed by the end of this year. And I took a report to service leadership team yesterday, setting out basically what the financial position is, what we still have to do, and crucially why we haven't been able to complete that work. So a number of the reasons I've brought before members previously, it's generally around resources at various times, either not being able to recruit, or we've had some gaps where someone has left and it's taken some time to replace them. But also there have been some occasions where we've not always been able to have the time we need from colleagues across the service due to other work pressures and priorities. I'm pleased to say that has moved quite a lot in recent times, and we're finding that is much less of an issue than it was earlier in the programme, which is fantastic. The outcome of the discussion at the meeting yesterday is that there's a commitment to complete the work of the programme, extending that into a further financial year. We have the money to do that. There's a bit of work to do around prioritisation and some analysis around the cost benefit, but that commitment is there to complete the work that we've set out in the programme. The policy work will be finished by the end of this financial year. It's really around the processes and some of the digital that are longer term pieces of work that will go over into 24-25. So that's the latest position with the programme. Obviously happy to take any questions members may have.
Obviously you accurately recounted the challenges we've had recruiting key personnel, not least the digital manager. In the written report we have, you mentioned the Fire Watch project manager, but I was pleased to hear what you said. We've been now are in a position to offer a job. That's great. So I'm assuming the other vacancies you mentioned verbally just happened in the timeline between submitting your written report.
Yeah, so the project delivery officer has very, very recently left. So she started in her new role, I think it's 2 weeks ago now. So that is very recent. The other one, which is the head of transformation, has been reassigned. He's now the head of operations, and so I've stepped up into that role temporarily over the last 8 months. And on Monday of this week, I was appointed to that role to the end of the programme. So those are how we're kind of covering those vacancies. Obviously, having those vacancies creates a further budget underspend, which we can carry over and then continue the work in the next financial year. The other thing I should have said is in that work that will carry over, the resources we need to complete that would be less than we have had in the rest of the programme, so it would be a slimmed down team.
Any other questions? Yes, sorry, yeah.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Ian, for your report. And firstly, I must congratulate you on your achievements. That's quite a lot you managed to achieve with all those under all those circumstances. So my question is, obviously, the budget was approved in 2021, but over the last 24 months, quite a lot change when it comes to economic conditions. Do you think this will impact financially on any of your upcoming projects?
I think I would say generally not. I guess the biggest spend area that isn't about revenue spend is around smart screen technology. So there will be some inflationary increase in terms of the cost, perhaps, of some of that technology, but it's still well within the capital reserve assigned to the programme. And even with carrying some work forward, we are still anticipating that at the end of 24-25 there will still be some residual budget that will be unspent and could perhaps be reallocated to other work in the service.
Thank you. And my second question, in terms of staffing, because that's one of the major issues, not just here, but quite a lot of industries suffering with the same concern. So in terms of staffing and finding the right people, and especially in your case, you need quite a lot of skilled people. So are we using any third parties in terms of finding a right talent?
So in terms of the digital apprentice, we're working with Western College and they're putting forward the candidates that I mentioned. The work packages that we're sending out to via our IT contractor goes to a company, a specialist company that they use called Netshell. So we produce a specification of work, they give us a quote, and then we decide if we're going to proceed with that or not. In terms of some of the kind of longer term need for digital expertise, there are a number of things that are being considered. So one of those is growing our talent internally. So we know from the programme work we've done, actually we already have people in the service who may not be in digital roles, but certainly have digital capability and some very successful upskilling. Quite a lot of the digital forms that have been built in Teams and using Power Apps have been produced by people with no previous digital experience. So we can do some upskilling, and we've also begun to have some discussions around a digital academy. We've got a leadership academy, and maybe we could do some digital equivalent. But also we have people across the service in different roles to differing degrees who have a digital element to their role. So something else that we can look at is create a community of practice that would bring those people together, not to take them out of their teams, but to bring them together into kind of a second layer of team, if you like, to both cross-populate in terms of knowledge and understanding, but also provide support and advice and potentially resource as well. So it's quite early stages. There's also some work that Angie is working on in terms of what our digital environment needs to look like, and making sure we've got those relevant resources. So it's still very much a work in progress, but yeah, there's a lot of discussions happening around that currently.
Thank you. And last question. Obviously, when it comes to the digital jobs, this sector is very lucrative when it comes to the private companies. So what plans are in place to retain the staff?
I think it's a very difficult one because, as you say, it's a very competitive marketplace. And particularly around Microsoft 365, there are a lot of organisations that are moving across to that. So developers and trainers and so on within that kind of field are very difficult to find. And I guess there is a risk that if we upskill people, they may leave. But I think there are two ways of looking at that. You know, you could say, why would we want to upskill if they're just going to go? Actually, they generate a lot of value to the service while that's happening. And if we can have a digital academy, we can get, you know, a churn, if you like, coming through. Retaining staff more generally, I think there's a whole load of factors. So some of the things we've talked about this morning in terms of our values and our culture, being a great place to work. Money is a driver, but it's not the only driver. And particularly in the public sector, you know, a lot of public sector workers could get better pay in the private sector, but they choose to work in this sector. So we're limited as to what we can do in terms of pay, but it's everything else that makes a difference that we're putting a lot of effort into. From, you know, the very beginning, so how we recruit people in, the process they go through, how engaged they are, the induction they receive, the support. We've got great development opportunities in the service for everybody in terms of, not just in terms of the role they do, but, you know, could potentially be other things as well. So it's really looking at the wider package and saying, what can we do to improve that, acknowledging that we have some constraints around our pay. But I do think we are doing really well in those other areas.
Okay, thank you.
Sorry, Chair, if I just talked very briefly on that. Attracting is our biggest challenge. Retaining, actually, we retain staff for quite a considerable period of time. As Ian has articulated there, it's not always perhaps the salary level, although that might be the initial, the initial consideration. It's that element that we struggle with attracting staff to apply. Once they're in the organisation and apply, actually our retention is quite good in various areas, even though they potentially could go externally and earn a higher salary with their skill sets. But we tend to retain staff through internal development, opportunities internally, different roles and things like that. And I would suggest that helps us, but the vacancy management is a difficult one.
Okay, so the report's for noting, so we don't need to vote on it. And the final report today is item 16, the annual report of the Local Pension Board 2022-23. I'm not sure who's delivering that one. Oh,
it's me. Thank you, Chair. As those who know me will know, I like to end a meeting on the topic of pensions. So here we go. So members, I'm presenting this next paper, which is on page 169 of your pack, on behalf of Andy Cunningham, who is the chair of the Local Pension Board, or as it's termed, the LPB. It asks the members to approve the publication of the LPB annual report for 22-23, which is in the appendix. For new members, you would have read a bit about the role of the LPB in one of Amanda's papers, but in headline, the purpose of the Local Pension Board is to assist this committee, as what they term the scheme manager, to ensure effective governance and administration of the firefighter pension schemes and ensuring compliance with the regulations, albeit it's not a decision-making body. So for every year since 2021, the LPB publishes its activities for the previous year and a look forward to the next year in an annual report. That's good practice and also helps with transparency, both for this committee but also the public and scheme managers. You'll see in the draft report at the appendix that the activities of the LPB in 22-23 really reflect that role in terms of governance. So you'll see they have been keeping up to date with legislation, which is kind of quite ever-changing in the world of sort of firefighter pension schemes at the moment, and also managing the pension risk register, and also applying scrutiny to those key areas of risk. So in particular, the application of national legal cases and outcomes, and also local risks, in particular the transition to the new pension provider, but during a time of complexity. You'll also see that they have a role and have been reviewing the current pension providers' delivery against the KPIs. And you'll also notice in the work programme of activities, they've been working to address any gaps or updates needed in policy and procedures. For example, last year, They looked at an IDRP policy, so that's the complaints policy. They recommended the adoption to Fire Authority at the time, and that's now been in place. And for next year, you'll see that they're doing a review of the procedures on discretions. So as a Policy and Resources Committee, they do a lot of work on those pension policies on your behalf, and those ones will come forward to you kind of in future. So I think that's probably all to cover on the annual report itself. I hope you've enjoyed the read of it. And the recommendation is to consider the report and approve its publication on the Avon Fire Authority website. Happy to take any questions, of course.
Any questions or comments? No? Okay. So, as Andrew said, the committee is asked to consider the report and approve the publication. Can I see all those in favour? Right. Okay, anybody against? No? Right. Thank you. So that concludes today's reports. Thank you all very much. I know it's been a really long morning. We've had an awful lot of reports to cover, but they've all been very worthwhile. So thank you to all the officers who prepared and presented them. It's really appreciated. And thank you to all the members, particularly the new members. We have rather overrun, I'm afraid, but I do apologise for that. We'll do better next time. So our next meeting will be the 29th of September at 10:30, and the venue for that one is Seven Park. So thank you all for coming, and I declare the meeting closed.